In 1908, a 10-year-old girl named Addie Card stood barefoot beside a spinning frame in a cotton mill in North Pownell, Vermont. Her tiny fingers worked the machinery during shifts that stretched 12 hours. She was one of countless children earning meager wages in America's factories. Lewis Hine captured her story in a photograph that would help document an era when childhood meant work, not school. But the shift from factory floors to classroom desks wasn't inevitable. It was a brutal fight that rewrote what it means to be a child. Today, we assume children belong in school. It seems natural, obvious, the way things should be. But this assumption, it's younger than your great-grandparents. For most of human history, childhood was brief and productive work was expected from an early age. The idea that society should force children into classrooms instead of letting them earn money was once as radical as any revolution. And like most revolutions, it came with consequences we're still living with. This transformation wasn't just about protecting kids. It rewrote childhood itself, reshaped the economy, and determined who gets to control how the next generation grows up. The story involves unlikely alliances between factory owners and social reformers, bitter fights between parents and the state, and children caught in the middle, often preferring the factory to the schoolhouse. To understand why this shift happened, we need to grasp what childhood looked like before schools took over. In 1800s America, the idea that children should spend their days in classrooms would have struck most families as absurd luxury. Children were economic assets, not burdens requiring investment. On farms, which employed most Americans, children had daily responsibilities from an early age. Boys learned their father's trade through apprenticeship that began in childhood. Girls mastered housekeeping, cooking, and childcare by working alongside their mothers. This wasn't exploitation in their minds, it was education. Children learned by doing, not by sitting. Then, industrialization changed everything. When factories sprouted across New England in the early 1800s, they created something unprecedented. Jobs that children could do almost as well as adults, but for much less money. Mill owners discovered that small fingers were perfect for threading looms and cleaning under dangerous machinery. Children could crawl into coal mines where adults couldn't fit. In glass factories, they could carry molten materials in spaces too cramped for grown workers. The numbers were staggering. By 1900, over 1.7 million children under 16 worked in mills, mines, and factories. In some textile towns, children made up a third of the workforce. These weren't teenagers picking up summer jobs. We're talking about 8-year-olds working 60-hour weeks in conditions that killed adults. But here's what's crucial. Many families needed this income to survive. A child's wages often meant the difference between eating and starving. When reformers started pushing for laws to get children out of factories, they weren't just fighting mill owners. They were fighting desperate parents who depended on their children's paychecks. Massachusetts passed the first significant child labor law in 1836, requiring factory children under 15 to attend school for at least 3 months per year. Notice what this reveals. Even the reformers weren't initially arguing that children shouldn't work at all. They just wanted some education alongside labor. The idea that childhood should be dedicated entirely to learning was still decades away. The resistance was fierce. Mill owners complained that child labor laws would make American factories uncompetitive. Parents argued that the government had no right to interfere with family decisions, and surprisingly, many children themselves preferred factory work to school. A 1909 survey of 500 children in Chicago factories found that most would rather work than attend classes. One child explained that in the factory, you can buy shoes for the baby. Another appreciated that employers give your mother your pay envelope. School offered no such tangible benefits. The breakthrough came when reformers realized that child labor laws alone weren't enough. Children banned from factories often ended up on the streets, not in classrooms. The solution was to make school attendance compulsory at the same time work was prohibited. This wasn't just about education, it was about social control. Massachusetts led the way in 1852 with the first comprehensive compulsory education law. Every city and town had to offer primary school. Attendance was mandatory for children between 8 and 14. Parents who refused faced fines and, in extreme cases, could lose their parental rights entirely. Their children would be apprenticed to others. This was revolutionary. The state was claiming authority over child rearing that had belonged exclusively to families for millennia. But here's where the story gets complicated. The push for compulsory education came primarily from middle-class reformers who had very specific ideas about what children should become. They weren't just concerned with literacy and numeracy, they wanted to create disciplined, punctual, obedient workers for the new industrial economy. Schools were explicitly modeled on factories, with bells marking periods, children arranged in rows, and strict hierarchies of authority. Horace Mann, often called the father of American public education, was remarkably frank about this goal. He argued that schools should teach children habits of regularity, punctuality, constancy, and industry, exactly the traits factory owners wanted. The classroom was designed to produce workers who would show up on time, follow orders without question, and accept their place in the social hierarchy. This wasn't education as we might imagine it today. Early compulsory schools were often grim places. Children sat in silence for hours, memorizing facts through endless repetition. Physical punishment was standard. The curriculum focused on basic literacy and numeracy, but the real lesson was obedience. One school inspector in 1890s New York noted approvingly that students were learning to sit still, keep quiet, and do as they're told. The enforcement was brutal. Truant officers, essentially educational police, hunted down children who skipped school. In industrial cities, they worked hand in hand with factory inspectors to ensure children had nowhere to hide. If you weren't in school, you couldn't work. If you weren't working, you had to be in school. The choice between factory and freedom was eliminated. But the most revealing aspect of this transformation was how it redefined childhood itself. Before compulsory education, children were seen as small adults who gradually took on more responsibility. After, childhood became a separate category of existence, a time of dependence and preparation rather than contribution. Children went from being economic assets to economic burdens, from workers to students, from contributors to consumers. This shift wasn't universal or immediate. Rural families resisted longer than urban ones. Poor families found ways around the laws when they could, and enforcement varied wildly by region and social class. Middle-class children were more likely to be in school, while working-class children were more likely to be truant or working illegally. The most surprising resistance came from immigrant families who often saw American schools as threats to their cultural identity. They preferred their children learn trades or work in family businesses rather than sit in classrooms where they'd be taught to reject their parents' ways of life. For many immigrants, child labor laws felt like cultural imperialism disguised as child protection. By the 1920s, the transformation was largely complete. Child labor had been dramatically reduced and school attendance had become the norm for children under 16, but the consequences went far beyond what reformers had intended. The creation of adolescence as a distinct life stage was perhaps the most significant unintended result. Before compulsory education, the transition from childhood to adulthood was gradual and work-based. After, society created a new category, teenagers who were physically mature but economically dependent, biologically adult but socially considered children. This artificial extension of childhood created tensions that persist today. The economic implications were equally profound. Removing children from the workforce didn't just protect them, it fundamentally altered labor markets. Adult wages rose as child competition disappeared. Families had to find new ways to support themselves without children's income. The concept of the family wage, that one adult worker should earn enough to support an entire family, emerged partly because children were no longer contributing economically. But perhaps most importantly, compulsory education created the modern concept of human capital. Children became investments rather than assets. Families and society began spending money on children with the expectation of future returns rather than immediate contributions. This shift laid the groundwork for our modern economy, where education is seen as the primary path to prosperity. The irony is that while reformers succeeded in getting children out of factories, they may have simply moved them into a different kind of factory, the school. The bells, the rigid schedules, the emphasis on compliance and conformity, all of this was deliberately designed to prepare children for industrial work. In trying to save children from exploitation, society may have created a more subtle but equally powerful system of control. Today, we're living with the legacy of these 19th century decisions. Our schools still operate on industrial models designed over a century ago. The assumption that all children should follow the same educational path regardless of their interests or abilities stems from this era. The idea that childhood should be entirely separate from productive work, that children shouldn't contribute meaningfully to their families or communities, comes from these reforms. And we're seeing the cracks. Rising numbers of young adults who are neither in school nor working suggest that the transition from student to worker isn't functioning as smoothly as reformers hoped. The artificial extension of childhood may be creating more problems than it solves. The next time you see children walking to school with their backpacks, remember that this scene would have been unimaginable to most families just 5 generations ago. Those children would have been in fields or factories, learning through work rather than books. The classroom conquered the workplace not through natural evolution, but through deliberate revolution, a transformation that redefined childhood, reshaped the economy, and created the world we now take for granted. Whether that transformation was entirely beneficial remains an open question, one that each generation must answer for itself.